In this video, we're going to talk about perfect intervals. Perfect doesn't mean that they're better than any other intervals, it's just the name that we give them because they have a kind of a distinct sound to them. Has to do with actually music theory of a long time ago. The way that they classified intervals had to do with frequencies of how strings would vibrate when those intervals were played. And so perfect intervals just happen to be intervals that had certain types of frequencies. But they do kind of have a little bit of a different sound, so we still classify them differently today. So remember, when we talked about major and minor intervals, we talked about how the fact that they can only be seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. The other four of the 8 intervals that we can have are 1, 4, 5, and 8. These intervals cannot be major or minor, but they can be perfect. They're not always necessarily perfect, but they can be perfect. So the way we find perfect intervals is actually exactly the way that we find major intervals. So you already know how to do it. If you start with a major scale, let's use B flat major. I know that I have 2 flats in B flat major, B flat and E flat, so I'm going to use that when I write my scale. So there's my B flat major scale, and from here I can determine my perfect intervals. I'm going to think about my scale degree 1 as being the lowest note of an interval. So for my perfect unison, which is a 1, my P1 or my PU, I guess you could say, would be from scale degree 1 to scale degree 1. So it would be B flat to B flat. That's pretty obvious. Anytime you have 2 of the same note together, that's a perfect unison. So yeah, we call it a unison, but it's actually also a perfect interval, which is really cool. If we have a fourth, so from scale degree 1 to scale degree 4, that's a perfect fourth. We use a capital P to show perfect. From B flat to E flat is a perfect fourth. If we go to scale degree 5, that's a perfect fifth. From B flat to F is a perfect fifth. And if we do the whole octave, or we call it either a perfect eighth, or a perfect octave is more common. So a P8 is a perfect octave. From B flat to B flat an octave above is considered a perfect octave. Those are your perfect intervals. So notice if I went up a sixth from B flat to G, that would not be a perfect sixth, that would be a major sixth, because sixth cannot be perfect, sixth can only be major. But going from B flat to E flat is not a major fourth, even though it's in a major scale. It's a perfect fourth because fourths can only be perfect. They can never be major, and they can never be minor. With major and minor intervals, we talked about how major intervals can become minor intervals by being made a half step smaller, and actually minor intervals could become major intervals by changing them and making them a half step bigger. So they can go in the opposite direction like that, but perfect intervals cannot change into major or minor intervals, they're only just perfect. So if you are asked to write a perfect interval, you would think about what the scale, the major scale, the bottom note, and you would write that interval. So if I'm asked to write a perfect fifth above E, I'll go up 5, E, F, G, A, B. And I'll ask myself, is B natural in the major scale of E? Or another way to say that is, what kind of B is in the major scale of E? So in E major, I have 4 sharps, F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, D sharp. B is not one of those sharps, so B natural is in the E major scale. So what I have written here is a perfect fifth. if I'm asked to write a perfect fourth above, let's say G sharp, well, first I'm going to write a fourth, so I know that it's going to be some kind of C. Now this one is interesting, because I want to think what kind of C is in the major scale of G sharp, but we actually don't have a G sharp major, do we? That's not one of our keys. So then, how can I figure this out? Is it possible to have a perfect fourth above G sharp if there's no G sharp major? Well, sure it is, because we're not actually writing a major scale. We're just writing two notes and we're determining the space between them. So out in music, sure, you could see a perfect fourth with G sharp as the bottom note, because it's not necessarily tied to the scale in context of the music. It's just what we use to figure out what the interval is. So it's a tool we use, but it doesn't necessarily mean that G sharp is going to be scale degree 1 in whatever you're doing. Like, you could be in E major right now. Like, you don't even know because you don't have a context for it. So because of that, it's totally possible to have this happen. But then it kind of puts a little bit of a wrench in our plans. So how are we going to figure out what a perfect fourth is above G sharp? Well, okay. One thing we can do is we can find a note close to this, like some other kind of G that's easier to work with, and work with that, and then later we'll like add the accidental back on. I'll kind of show you what I mean. So here I don't like thinking about G sharp because there's no G sharp major, but G major, now that's really nice to think about. So I'm going to go ahead and over here in my separate work area, I'm going to go ahead and figure out what a perfect fourth is above G first. That'll help me, I think, figure out what to do. Notice that it's still some kind of C, right? Because the number hasn't changed. I'm still working with G. So, all right, I'm going to think about G major now and just ignore this part completely. So, okay, a perfect fourth above G. So what kind of C is in G major? G major has one sharp. That sharp is F sharp. So C natural is in G major. So this is a perfect fourth. Good. Okay. So how can I translate that then back to my problem is the question. Well, if I know that, I'm going to use my fingers again to show distance. So if I have G here and C here, and this is exactly a perfect fourth, but I'm not talking about a G, I'm talking about a G sharp. So the bottom note is going to move up a half step to G sharp. But if I want this distance to stay the same, I need to move both of them up. So remember, it's the same interval, it's the same distance between the notes. So if I have G to C is a perfect fourth and I'm moving the bottom note up, it's going to force the top note also to move up a half step, right? Bottom note goes from G to G sharp, top note goes from C up a half step to C sharp. And that right there is a perfect fourth. So it takes a couple extra steps to get there, but you can still figure it out. You just have to take a little extra time to think it through. That, I think, is probably the best way to figure out an interval that starts on a note that does not have its own major scale. You will see that, and it is confusing, but I like to just take the accidental off and figure out what it would be without the accidental, and then you can put the accidental back on and just make sure you raise or lower both of the notes in the interval the right amount so that they stay the same, so you still have the same distance between the notes, because that's what we're really getting at when we get at these interval qualities. Okay, so that's how you write perfect intervals. To recognize perfect intervals, you do the same thing you would do for a major interval. You look at it, you determine if the top note is in the major scale of the bottom note, and if it is, and it's a unison, a fourth, a fifth, or an octave, it's perfect. If it's a second, third, sixth, or seventh, it would be major. So the only difference between perfect and major then is the actual note of the interval, the number. Sorry, I'm getting all my words confused because there's so many. The number of the interval is the only thing that will determine if it's perfect versus major. So that's how you do that. All right, so perfect intervals are, I think, not a terribly difficult thing to understand when you already know major intervals, but it's really, really important to remember that perfect intervals cannot turn into minor intervals ever. They just are totally different ways of thinking. So, all right, so that's that. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon.